Hey everybody, welcome to chapter 12, Medieval Synthesis and its Cracks. So in this chapter we're going to look at the church a little bit more. We'll look at education a little bit, a couple of kings. I think we'll look at France, the Mongols a little. Um, and then we'll end it with some disasters, which Europe has a large share of in this time period, here in the 13th and 14th centuries. So that's what we'll look at. A few different things in this section. Aristotle instructing the monks. Aristotle instructing the monks. Aristotle instructing the monks. I'm just wondering if anyone gets that for a moment. Does anyone understand the issue with that? Aristotle lived centuries before Jesus was ever even born. So there were no monks when Aristotle lived. There was no Aristotle when there were monks. So this is the church rewriting history, in essence, indicating Aristotle actually instructing Christian monks. You have him, you have heaven, you have angels, you have God above. This is, again, sort of this attempt by the church to both rewrite history while simultaneously bringing together the classical ideals, which have now become really popular in the Renaissance, classical ideals of Rome and Greece, bringing those together, trying to bring that together with religion. I don't know for sure. I haven't studied Aristotle in detail or anything, but I think Aristotle would not have been someone who would have really supported institutionalized religion. He was a philosopher, believed in logic and science, although it wasn't science, it was called natural philosophy then. Somehow I just don't think that. Somehow I think the reality is Aristotle would not have been popular with the church had Aristotle lived in the same time period as this here. But it's interesting. It's interesting how the church is trying to, as it says in the name of the chapter, synthesis. Synthesis is bringing things together, creating a new. You bring things together, you create a new form. It's a synthesis. You're synthesizing something new. And that's really what they're trying to do. We see really strange things with the church in this time period. You see many different church writings, many different church imagery, painting, art, sculpture that looks Greek and Roman, pagan even. You even see pagan gods. So the church is trying to use the imagery and the idea of classical learning, which was often sort of seen as the golden age of European society back during Rome and Greece. Trying to bring that back, this rebirth, and yet it's just really strange that they're trying to mix Christian theology with pagan theology. It's almost like they're looking at the classical world and they're simply using it as a symbol. They're not really they're not really talking about the gods. They're not really talking about the pagan gods. Uh, it's like you have to take the classical world and somehow set aside the actual theology of it, and yet you still are left with the symbols of paganism. Kind of interesting. I will be skipping some things in this chapter. There's some things in this chapter that I just think I don't really need to go over. They're really just too complicated, too detailed for the survey class, I think. So I do skip a few things. So we're going to start here with B, the Inquisition. Inquisition was a method used to summon people. They would summon people. In essence, it's sort of like a church court. They would summon people. They would discover facts, uncover facts, or try to, and then punish people, punish them for their crimes. Typically, crimes against the church or crimes. The most common crime would be heresy, meaning you're simply not supporting the church, or you're not following the church's core beliefs, or the Orthodox belief at the time, which was the Catholic Church. You're not following it, so you're a heretic. Heresies could be Jews, heresies could be Muslims, heresies could be other Christians. Just simply any Christian, and there was multiple types of Christianity that was simply not following the Orthodox Catholic Christianity. Now, anyone who did not attack heretics, anyone who did not form inquisitions, which we see it in France, we see it in Spain, other countries, you actually would face excommunication from the church, being kicked out of the church. which of course could threaten your immortal soul. So many peoples, many countries, many kings, many parts of Europe simply felt it was necessary to create an Inquisition. Even if there was no obvious heresies around, you had to do it, and then you had to find the heretics. You had to find somebody who you could then persecute and prosecute to appease the church, to make it look like you were doing your job. Um, yeah. Inquisitors were usually appointed by the church, usually appointed by the Catholic Church. They would round up people suspected of heresy. They would interrogate them, and yes, interrogation did include torture. Torture was common. Many medieval torture devices were used by the church to force people to recant their beliefs or to admit crimes, whether or not they'd ever committed any crimes or not. Then at the general inquest, an inquest is sort of the court, sort of the church court to try you for your heresies. You'd be questioned about what you know about the heresy, about whether you know people. You would be then pushed to inform on other people. And it's the same thing to where people felt they had to create the Inquisition because of the pressure from the church. Otherwise, the church would come down on them. Well, people brought before the courts, the Inquisitions, would then point fingers at others having nothing to do with it, having committed no crimes, even probably full on faithful Catholics, but they'd point their fingers at them to deflect attention from themselves, hoping they could get out of it by basically giving someone else up. Um, if you quickly recanted, you would be okay. You simply said you were wrong. If you admitted you didn't know you were a heretic, you didn't understand what you're doing is heretical, then you might get off lightly and without too severe a punishment. You might be given a lenient penalty. But anyone who refused to repent would be viewed as a threat to their community, or viewed as a threat to the salvation of their community, punished severely, including torture, imprisonment, and execution for simply not supporting the Catholic Church's belief in God and their particular guidelines, their particular structure. For not supporting them, you could find yourself imprisoned, tortured, or executed. This is what Europe was in this time period. The most powerful institution in Europe was the Church, the Catholic Church. So it was hands down. In many ways, it overpowered kings and emperors. Um, There wasn't really an emperors in Europe, but sometimes people called themselves emperors. All right, what about Jews in this time period? How were the Hebrews treated with the authority of the Catholic Church running amok through Europe? Jews have been perceived as aliens, foreigners for a very long time. They'd often lived under legal restrictions, restrictions on owning land, owning businesses, restrictions on having to pay extra taxes. All this had literally been going on for 1,000 years, all the way back to the Roman Empire. So Jews had been continually and regularly persecuted and challenged and what's the word I'm looking for? They were constantly under suspicion just for being Jews. Had always been that way. It's worse in the medieval ages. Often their lands were taken from them. We sort of talked about this already. Many Jews migrated to cities because their farms, their lands, their homes were taken away from them, or they had to pay really high rents more than anyone else, extra taxes they had to pay. Well, in the cities, the way to make money, the way to have a successful career is you often had to join a guild. Well, they make it really tough. Many guilds simply refuse to allow Jews. They simply refuse to allow Jewish people in the guilds. Because generally speaking, Jews are heretics under the Catholic Church's guidelines. They're considered heretics, to be alienated, to be treated as pariahs, and to be discriminated, exploited as much as possible. Because Jews did not convert. Rarely ever did Jewish people convert. They were willing to die for their faith, so it didn't really happen. Um, Many of them were compelled to live as moneylenders because it's the only way they could make money. They had to actually loan money and to give out loans and things like this. Basically, they become bankers. Some of them become small bankers because they can't get any other type of business. The money lending was not like today. We think of bankers as a highly prestigious position and rich and wealthy and big money and fancy cars, et cetera, et cetera. Back then, being a money lender was not a prestigious position. Moneylender was literally like a low rank in society. You were think like a loan shark today. Loan sharks are criminals. So think a loan shark. That is what money lending would have been like in this time period. You would have been just on the edge of criminality. It wasn't like a prestigious banker. It was more like a loan shark. And they were treated very disrespectfully for it. But in many ways, it's the only way they could make money for many of them. Many Europeans claimed the Jews as serfs. They treated them as serfs on land. They would take their land from them and then force the Jews to actually work on the Lord's estate or the Lord's manor. They took their property. Kings, we talked about Henry II. We talked about Philip Augustus, England and France. We talked about all those. They imposed taxes on Jews. They took their property, things like this. Arbitrary, just because they were Jews. Exploitation, expulsion was common, which is interesting because they would even sometimes borrow money from Jewish people. They would treat them terribly on one hand, and then tomorrow turn around and ask to borrow money from Jewish moneylenders. Um, really interesting. Attacks on Jews also grew out of teachings about the Mass. The Catholic teaching of the Mass actually led to attacks on Jewish populations. This is a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it as easy as I can. Okay. According to new teachings of the Mass, the Catholic Mass, a priest would bless the wine and the bread. They would bless the wine and the bread. And in essence, what this meant was that the wine was now the blood of Jesus and the bread was now the body of Jesus. And many Catholics took this literally believing, almost like it was a miracle, that once it was blessed by the priests, that wine was actually blood. Not representative, but actually blood. And the bread they ate wasn't bread, it was actually the flesh of Jesus. Some people took this literally. They believed it was real. They fully believed that this is actually, it wasn't representative, it wasn't it wasn't somehow functional, it was meant as actual reality. Many Christians were anxious about this idea that they were actually consuming the blood and the body of Christ, not figurative, but literal. Well, some people start to think that if the Christians are doing this, there's an idea that the Jews will rightfully is the wrong way to put it, similarly maybe, the Jews will then similarly reenact this type of ritual as well. Only for them, they'll actually crucify a living person. So the Christians are drinking the blood of Christ and eating the body of Christ, while the Jews are actually crucifying people. This idea that they're doing something in some similar way, and that the Jews might actually be crucifying children, things like this. Christian children, of course. This is it's crazy, really, in a way, but it's real. There's many people that seem to believe the Jews are now actually sacrificing and killing Christians. There's actually a name given to this. It's called blood libel. So Christians start attacking Jews. They start attacking them, burning down other churches, kicking them out of their homes. We see mass massacres of hundreds, even thousands of Jews across England, France, Spain, Germany. It's bad. It's really bad. And we do think this entire idea of this blood libel really grows out of this new doctrine of the Mass. That it is somehow by association, if the Christians are doing something like this, and of course, as Christians are doing it right, because it is, originally was just bread and wine, they're not actually killing anyone. Now the Jews, of course, are doing it wrong, and they're actually killing somebody to reenact the crucifixion. It's really interesting. It's no one in Europe in this time probably was even aware of it, but it's actually sort of ironic in a way because the Romans actually persecuted the Christians 1,000 years earlier because they actually believed the Christians were killing people, were killing Romans to eat them and drink their blood. Uh, Sort of exactly what the Christians are accusing the Jews of here. The Romans accused the Christians of doing that back shortly after the time of Jesus. I don't believe there's any association. I'm not aware of this actually being connected in any way, but it's really interesting how this sort of repeats itself in a weird, twisted way 1,000 years later. Very similar thing. Only now it's this time it's the Christians doing the persecuting of others. It's really interesting. Um, Jews were expelled in 1291. Even England actually created a law forbidding any Jews from living in England. All Jews were kicked out of England, and they were forbidden from even entering the borders of England. It got pretty bad, really did. Outcasts, really, were outcasts through all of Europe. Sometimes lepers were also associated with Jews. Why is that? All right. The skin condition of a leper was seen as an external sign of their sinfulness. In other words, they're sinful inside, they're heretics inside, just anyone, and it shows on the outside of their body, and that's leprosy. Which of course is ridiculous, but that was seen by many people as a form of your sin actually destroying your body. Um, Often they would be arrested, tortured, made to give false confessions against Jews. Um, they would be told that they had to confess to assisting or helping Jews or being with Jews, helping poison wells and rivers. Pretty crazy stuff. Now, leprosy is what's called Hansen's disease. Um, it's actually thought that many types of illnesses and sicknesses in the Middle Ages was considered leprosy. Many diseases that actually were not leprosy, but yet anyone who showed some type of an outward skin condition, a severe skin condition, or some type of sickness or illness, was thought to be manifesting their actual inward sinfulness. Um, Interesting. Lepers were not allowed to live in society, of course, because their disease was contagious and disfiguring, of course. And of course, in many places, we see lepers being tolerated or even beloved by the Jews in the Jewish writings. They accepted and they tolerated lepers. They even preached to and lived among the lepers. You can find that in Jewish scriptures. So, for the learned people who are actually familiar with Jewish scriptures, you can find associations with Jews and lepers. And lepers in Christian society now are seen as evil and sinful. It's really seemed like they're really stretching, but in essence, in any way possible that any Christian authority could find to twist it so that Jews were the enemy and the bad guy, they did. Therefore, to attack, persecute, terrorize, and exploit Jewish populations by any way possible. Even making up crazy, ridiculous stories that became very popular and well accepted by many people. Interesting. All right. Reconciling this world and the next. Part 2 in here. The achievements and failures of scholasticism. I've said at the beginning, one of the things we'll talk about in this chapter is education. So we're going to look at that a little bit. Scholasticism was a logical method of inquiry and exposition. Expositions where you're talking and discussing. So logical method of inquiry and exposition to sum up and reconcile all knowledge. Yeah. Imagine trying to do that today. I mean, what is like the internet got? Like 100 billion pages of information or 100 trillion pages of information. Can you imagine someone trying to reconcile all the information? Anyway, so the idea of scholasticism is to somehow reconcile all faith and all knowledge. And yes, scholasticism tries to find a way to blend secular, which is non-religious, with sacred knowledge. Somehow to blend secular and sacred together, logic and reason with faith and spirituality. Challenging to do. Scholastics are very confident they could do this. Scholastics are confident their reasoning could use knowledge, and they could use this knowledge obtained through the senses and through reading, and they could find the ultimate truth in the world. And this ultimate truth, considering how religious Europe was, had to involve religion and God. to come up with ultimate truth, leaving religion out of it, would have been sacrilegious, would have been heretical. That's a good word. You would have found yourself up in front of the Inquisition. Um, there were many different writings, many different books created in this time period. A general term we use is a summas, which translates as summary of knowledge. A summary of knowledge. So these summas, they try to cover sometimes an entire field. Think like a collection of books that cover all of a particular topic. Literally everything about a particular topic that is known, and these are like major topics, like I don't know at the time what topics they would have used. Philosophy, for instance, mathematics. To have a couple books that summed up all math knowledge, all philosophy knowledge. In this time period, they could sort of do that because knowledge was far more limited. But that's what they wanted to do. And they often tried to reconcile Aristotle's teachings of logic and reason, with religious teachings, philosophy with Christian faith. Tried to do this. Well, as it says in the title, failures. It doesn't do very well. It's very challenging. St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, he lived from 1225 to 1274. He was probably the most famous scholastic of the time. He was a master at the University of Paris, so he was both a priest, monk, I think, and a teacher. So he was a teacher, a master. In 1272, he published the Summa Theologica. 1273, it is the Summa, in other words, a summary of knowledge about religion. Theology is religion. So a sum of all knowledge about religion. Wow, that had to be something. He explored in great deal all important topics, human and divine. He published it as he was dying. Simply put, he didn't have it put out until on his deathbed. And even then, he debated whether it should just be destroyed or burned. Because he takes this book, and I think it may be more than one book, and he writes through it, and he starts at the beginning, make very clear he wants to combine theologic teaching with secular teaching, reason and logic and God, and put them together. He believes fully. He's a priest. He's a priest, a monk. He believes fully that reason and logic and science, which they may not even be using the term science yet, but basically science, can be reconciled with religion. He then writes the whole thing, spends several years on it, gets to the final conclusion, and at the end, he comes to start to doubt the existence of God. He starts to question, by the end of the book, through his years of study and learning and exploration and reason, and he comes to really start to wonder, is it possible to reconcile reason, logic, science with God? Or are they mutually exclusive? And he dies. He really believed that he could be persecuted, prosecuted by the church, and actually find himself up before the Inquisition. Again, he was an old man. He died. Done deal. But had he lived longer, he might have found himself in chains and behind bars, maybe. Certainly excommunicated for the kinds of things that he sort of came up to. He doesn't make a clear conclusion. He leaves it open to interpretation. But he makes it very clear by the end of the Summa Theologica that he could not bring science and God together. He couldn't find a way to reconcile them, which leads us to big questions. He really thought people might look at it and say, does God exist? And well, he died before those questions were ever answered in his time period. All right, the weakenings of the empire. What empire? Generally, we're actually talking about the empire in Europe. The whole idea of empire, of large, powerful nations. Remember, an empire, I've said it once before, probably many chapters ago. An empire is one large geopolitical structure dominates other smaller minority political entities that had been previously independent. So, It's one large political structure dominates other smaller political structures, political entities that had been independent at one point, and they sort of control them or dominate them. Uh, well, we really see it going the other way by the Middle Ages here. By the end of the Middle Ages, by the 1400s, we actually see Europe fracturing. Ultimately, by the end of the 1400s, Europe is over a dozen different states, different kingdoms. We have a couple of big ones, of course, France and England, Germany, a couple of big ones, but we really see a lot of really small, more independent kingdoms. Uh, and this is sort of how it collapses. Or collapse is the wrong word. It just sort of slowly comes apart. Maybe not a collapse exactly. Well, a big part of this was clashes between the church and the different leaders, specifically here, the German emperors. Um, the Pope and the emperors, it really goes back to Barbarossa. Barbarossa, of course, tried to control Italy, even claimed control of Italy. He named it the freaking Holy Roman Empire, without the freaking part, because he believed he was actually the inheritor of Rome's glory, which was ridiculous. But he thought so, or he acted like it anyway. Well, Rome said no. Remember, Barbarossa claimed dominance over Rome, and almost immediately Rome said, no, we're not going to allow that. And they broke away and became independent. So, from the very beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, it was neither holy nor Roman because it never really ever dominated Italy. As soon as it was created, Italy said, no, we're not, we're checking out, we don't want any part of it. Well, it was crucial to control Italy if you wanted to actually have any authority over the church. Now, many kings would have said they stood above the church. In reality, more often than not, when the Pope basically said jump, the kings jumped. So the kings would tell other people they were superior to everyone other than God. Not necessarily. They may have said they were superior. They were superior to the church, but not superior to God. Because the kings often claimed they were divine themselves. So the kings ruled with divine right. So they were, in essence, connected to God directly. They didn't need the church. The kings were divinely anointed, therefore they were connected to God or religious authority all on their own without having to go through the intermediary, the church. Well, the reality was that was all symbolic. The truth was you couldn't get jack shit done in Europe if the church wouldn't back you up. It's just that simple. If the Catholic Church was your enemy, you were going down a path of a dead end path. So even if the church, even if you weren't necessarily on the best of terms with the church, you had to at least be amicable with them. You had to at least be okay and neutral with them, at the very least. To be an enemy of the church was to be an enemy of Europe, really. Um, and so this really did poorly for Germany because Germany ended up getting on the bad side of the church because they kept claiming dominance over the church, and the church kept saying no, no, sorry, no, and eventually it really pisses off the popes. All right, Barbarossa's grandson Frederick II ruled from 1212 to 1250. He ruled that time, so he ruled for almost 40 years. He labored without success. He again continued to try taking over Italy. It actually got so bad that the Pope excommunicated him. Excommunicated the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. I'm sorry. It's just funny. I'm the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but I'm not in the church. I was kicked out of the church. It's just funny. It just is. The high and mighty and the powerful, and they can wave their hand and execute dozens of people, but when it comes to the church and to God, they really are powerless. It's interesting. Lots of divisions. It really weakens Germany. Germany really sort of falls apart, and literally from the 1300s to the 1900s, Germany is we'll put it this way. I've said this before. Multiple times, Germany is ruled by over 100 different lords, 100 different princes, dozens of kings. Germany is not a unified state again, really, until modern times. An actual unified state until modern times. It's always in flux. In other words, there's times when a king will rise up and he'll conquer several territories and he'll claim he's king of Germany. and then his son will come along, and it'll all fall apart, and suddenly there's 100 kings again. It doesn't. There's no stability in Germany for 600 years, really, until modern times. And this was that time when we do call Holy Roman Empire, even though it was none of that. 1273, we see the German princes bestowed a meaningless title, the Holy Roman Emperor. We have the first time the title is given, Holy Roman Emperor. There were, even Barbarossa considered himself the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but he was never given that official title. It was sort of a self-created image. It was false. He does eventually. We do get Rudolf here in 1273 officially given that title. But by this point in time, what Rudolf ruled was like a third of what Barbarossa ruled. So the empire is now a third of its size. And here we have the actual first official title of Holy Roman Emperor. Even though, almost 100 years earlier, Barbarossa really considered himself the same thing. Well, let's look at France a little bit. Louis IX and a new ideal of kingship. The more successful rulers of Europe were usually content with smaller, more manageable kingdoms. We do usually find the most successful ones being like England, which is just an island, a small island. France, which is generally just the Ile-de-France and the territories around the Ile-de-France. Those territories generally seem to be more successful and even richer, having more status and power without having empires. The age of empire in Europe is over. There will be one more. I think only one more. And that, of course, will be Napoleon in 1800, who does, for a few years, create an empire in Europe that crashes apart just about as fast as they put it together. But that's it. Empire in Europe is over, really, until Napoleon creates an empire that lasts, 8 years, maybe? I don't think it even lasts that long. Louis was revered. We're back to Louis here, Louis IX. Louis was revered as the administrator, a judge. He was considered a just father of the people. He was considered a good king. Look how long he ruled. 50 years. He ruled almost 50 years. You really have to be pretty well liked to rule that long, because somebody's going to remove you. Some family member, another family, another king, a brother, a son, an uncle. You're simply going to be assassinated. To rule for 50 years, you have to be pretty good, or you have to have an absolute power. And he didn't have absolute power. France in this time period was pretty small, actually, much smaller than modern France. He imposed law. He imposed justice over France. We get the permanent housing of Parliament. This is their governing body, the permanent Parliament in France. We also get the Royal Court of Justice, sort of what we would compare to like a Supreme Court today. Supreme Court, the Royal Court of Justice. This becomes permanently housed in France, pardon me, in Paris, and Paris becomes the official center of France. Now, the kings didn't always live in Paris. Sometimes they lived other places, Versailles, for instance, I think, and there's other places they would live. But Paris really becomes the governmental, political, and economic center of Paris during this time period of France. If you know what I'm saying. Paris becomes the center of France. It becomes where all the authority is. We see all the governments. Even if the kings weren't there all the time, the government of France was generally housed in Paris. Louis had a large kingdom. He did not have expansion. He generally was peaceful, didn't have a lot of expansion, didn't grow, which also is the new ideal of kingship. That's why we call it this. To be a king previous to this meant you were on the warpath. You had to constantly attack, grow, expand, and conquer. All kings did this. It was the way kings ruled. Louis did not. He kept what he had, and he kept the peace. He reduced warfare and violence. He fed the people. We actually see a proliferation of arts, architecture, sculpture, Renaissance. We see a Parisian Renaissance. All this happens under Louis because he had a generally peaceful tenure in office for almost his whole kingship. was peace. Um, really different. This was different. This was more like an actual modern leader, more like a modern president, really, which was about peace and prosperity and success for the country, not about conquering foreign lands for glory, which had been the typical standard for kings in Europe: glory and honor and power and treasure. Interesting. Um, Royal and sacred power should work together, neither being subservient. So he obviously got well along with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church liked him so much they canonized him. Canonizing is where you're made into a saint. He is made into a saint by the church because he so supported the church's authority in France and the Inquisition. You know, got to take that side of it. That the church considered him almost like a hero of the church. Uh, he did not advocate violence against Jews. He did hate Jews, though. He didn't like them. He didn't advocate violence, but he did advocate expulsion. We see many Jewish communities actually moved out of France, moved to the borders. It's really interesting. Either they were moved to the very edge, literally they were on the border, to where they weren't technically kicked out of the country, but they were relocated to the far fringe, where they would be the farthest away from Paris and the Ile-de-France, or they were moved outside the country, even though they weren't technically persecuted. We do see occasional arrests of Jewish populations, things like this. He was canonized, winning a lot of authority for the French monarchy. I mean, obviously, it doesn't happen often that kings are sainted. It isn't often at all. So the fact that he was given sainthood means, I don't know if the rules were the same back then. Today, to be sainted by the church, you have to have evidence of 2 miracles you've actually performed in your lifetime. There has to be actual concrete, at least according to the church, concrete evidence of miracles you performed. I've read about him. I've read a book about him, and I don't. It's not really clear what the miracles are he performed. But then maybe that wasn't the requirement back then. Maybe that wasn't required. Um, Here we have Louis as a boy. He was a boy king. He came to rule as a teenager, and here we have him with Blanche of Castile. This is his mother. Castile is a province of it's a kingdom actually. It's a kingdom in Spain in this time period. She ruled as regent. In case you can't see this, she has a crown on her head, the same as him. He's on the right, she's on the left. She has a crown on her head. He holds the scepter, so it indicates he's king. But she ruled as regent for years. This actually shows a lot of authority. Women had more authority in France, and we actually see women being held in higher esteem in France than probably most of Europe. You can see the colors here. It's not really relevant to what we're talking about here, but I think the colors are interesting. These colors of gold and purple are regal colors. They're golden colors, or golden colors. Sorry, they're royal colors, only for kings and royalty. Many places in Europe, it was actually illegal. These colors are pretty common to use these colors for kings. It was actually illegal to wear these colors. You couldn't dye your clothes the purple or gold. Only it was reserved only for certain people of certain status who could actually use that color. Interesting. Here we have Louis's kingdom during his reign. See, it's much smaller. France previously would have gone all the way over here to the Rhine River. It would have been big. If you actually think about the Frankish kingdom, the Frankish Empire covered like most of what is Germany and France. This is much smaller. This is about the size of England. Not big at all. So you have this territory right here. These are independent territories in white. And then you have this, which is actually held by England, I think. Yeah, English possessions in 1259. It's actually held by England. Much smaller territory, much more manageable, and generally more prosperous. People were happier when he wasn't out trying to form an empire. So yeah, it really is a period of time where the authority and power and the sort of the direction of Europe is going the other way, to where for hundreds of years it had always been about bigger and bigger empires. Now it's really smaller. It's really about smaller kingdoms and states. The birth of representative institutions. All right. In the 13th century, to get more appeal, to get more support from the masses, we see many kings across Europe summon parliaments. These parliaments are governing bodies. They're like our Congress. They're legislatures. They are supposed to be representative of the people to make the laws that are then representative of the people. They're supposed to be of the people for the people, basically what the parliaments are. And the kings do this to get support from the people, believing that the people will feel more representative, more protected, more respected in this way. Gradually, these sessions become permanent. Initially, they were often temporary, like in France, for instance. In France, the parliament initially, and even later on, actually, uh, technically only comes into action when the king calls parliament. In other words, like our Congress here in Washington, it would be like if our Congress only actually was in session and made laws when the president called them to do it. But when Congress wasn't there, the president would make all the rules and make all the laws and make all the decisions. And then when in very times of need or stress or general popular uprising, when the people aren't happy, then you would call the parliament to come in and appease the population by making some laws and policies that make people happy. Eventually, these become official and they become standard. They were supposed to represent all three estates. So initially, the parliament was supposed to represent the nobles, the nobility, the church, the clergy, and those who work, the laborers, the common people, most people. They were supposed to represent people from all levels of society. Um, that's problematic because we often will find that the parliament will vote based upon its socioeconomic class lines. In other words, the rich would vote one way, the church would vote one way, and the common people would usually go a third way. Well, the problem you've got is, more often than not, the church and the rich were more aligned in their wants and needs. So what usually happened, you have all three estates represented, but the church and the nobility generally side with each other, and therefore they control the most of the votes and most of the power. And so most of the decisions are made that lean towards the benefit of the church and the nobility, who usually have more money, more power, more status. Um, and the rest of the folks, the common people, which are most people, would be left out in the cold. It looked good on paper, but the parliaments often weren't very effective for the reason I just described. Now, as more and more people start to participate, more and more people get involved in the parliaments. The parliaments do come to make laws that represent the common people, and we see them making laws that benefit the population. Parliaments do become more popular, even if they're often overridden by the clergy and the nobility. They do still, obviously, if they never got anything done, it would destroy the whole idea of it. The whole structure would fall apart if 1/3 of the power never had any power. So they do get some laws passed. They do get some changes made regarding taxes and land value and land taxes and peasants and serfs. Um, we do get some things that are beneficial to commoners, just not nearly as much as would be appropriate when you consider the vast majority of the population were commoners. So even though they're 80, 90% of the population, the actual power and authority they have would probably be in the 10 or 20% range. It's still better than zero. It's a lot better than zero. In Spain, the Cortes was an assembly. This assembly was the first to really include townspeople, common people. Eventually, we see common people working together with the lords and the aristocrats and working together with the Catholic Church to make these official councils, which we call these cortes, these official councils. It's not exactly like a parliament. It's sort of like a parliament, only a smaller version that counseled the king. And the king was really still the power, but the councils were supposed to represent all of the different factors of society, the different groups, the different status, the merchants and the lords and the priests and the commoners. It's supposed to represent all of them. And then they sort of advise the king. And then ideally, the king will make decisions based upon the advice and counsel of the Cortes. How well did it really work in practice? Because, the king's still the king. Hard to say. Hard to really know. In 1260s, Lord Simon de Montfort, it's a pretty cool name, I like that. He captured the King of England and became England's ruler. He captures the King of England and becomes what we call de facto. He wasn't the king, but he captures the king. He takes over the court. He takes over basically the government, and he's effectively the king, which is the de facto king. It was a coup. It was basically a coup. He took over the government. Even though he wasn't technically king. He was the de facto leader. Simon called a parliament in 1265. He summons all the people, and again we see another creation of a three-tier, a three-level, with the clergy, the nobility, and the townspeople. This becomes a pattern all across Europe. The three estates are how European society had been divided for, wow, by this point in time, 500 years. This idea of where everyone in Europe pretty much fell into the class of either those who work, those who pray, or those who fight. Now, we talked about in last chapter, there's sort of a separate little sector. We now have the merchant classes. We now have sort of the city people, which are a little bit different. They don't necessarily fit into one of the three categories. But outside of really dense urban areas, and there were only a couple of them in the entirety of Europe, the rest of the people, which was the majority of the people, still lived in societies that still followed the guidelines of those who work, those who pray, and those who fight, even if they didn't really fight anymore. So everything that happens in this time period seems to fall along that frame, that sort of that format. So they call the clergy, they call the nobility, and they call the common people together in the English Parliament. And for a few years, we have an actual sort of representative government in England. Sort of representative government. You might think because of the Magna Carta, yeah. No, not really. The Magna Carta changed things to the point to where there were lots more common laws. But I think I sort of said that back then. The Magna Carta looks really good on paper. But actually, in practice, the monarch was still a monarch. The king was still a king. And the king could still, as the example I used a little while ago, execute all them, kill them all. And it would be done. So the king was still the king. It really looked good writing it down and saying that, the king is beholden to the same rules as everyone else. But we know the fact. The rich and wealthy, the nobility, the elite get away with shit that the rest of us would go to prison for. It still is that way today. Whether it is wealthy politicians, wealthy business people, celebrities, we do know the reality is, even though technically the law applies to everybody equally, we know that sometimes immigrants and minorities get screwed. They do not get fair treatment of the law. And we know on the other spectrum, the other side of it, we know that the rich, the powerful, the celebrities often get away with stuff that you and I would go to jail for. It's the same back then. Magna Carta is down. The king's supposed to follow the same rules as everyone else. The king is beholden to the people, but the truth of the matter is, more often than not, the kings are still kings and do whatever they want. More often than not. Well, for a few years, Simon here actually reverses that. And Parliament basically runs England. The Parliament, which is a combination of all three states, are really running England for a while. Well, eventually Simon, I think he's executed. I think he's eventually killed or executed. What does the next king do? He immediately disbands Parliament and gets rid of the idea of representative government. However, it just needs to be. I mean, why do we even talk about it? If it just goes away and it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. It does matter because this sets a precedent. The Magna Carta, 50 years before this. Um, Simon de Montfort's the creation of the Parliament. All of this sets a precedent that in the coming centuries, this idea of representative government becomes standard, and eventually Parliament becomes permanent in both England and France. Eventually, the countries are run by this representative government with elected officials. Eventually. So it sets a precedent, it sets an idea up that later people will build upon. So it starts building a foundation. Even if the actual parliament has very minimal effect in this time period in the 12 and 1300s, it has a little effect and it starts to change some people's ideas about how government should function and the power of the king. And in coming centuries, that shifts, it morphs the entire political structure of Europe. So it's a beginning. That's really what it is. It's a beginning. Everything has to begin somewhere. Well, we're definitely going to shift gears here because now we're going to talk about the Mongols. Quite a bit different than what we've been talking about. You got to love the Mongols. You really don't. You should hate them, actually. I consider them to be the world's first terrorists, really. And that's saying a lot when you consider all the things we've talked about in Europe and all the tragedies and the wars and all the stuff. And then the Mongols come along and they're worse. They're worse than probably anyone. We could spend a whole class talking about the Mongols. They're a very interesting topic. What really happens here? Well, in essence, this fragmentation of Europe sort of coming apart, leaves it open to invasions from Asia, leaves it open to nomadic horse warriors invading from Central and Eastern Asia. They eventually, and I should go ahead and explain further, this fracturing we see, it happens all across the old world to where the empires fall and we see all kinds of smaller states and kingdoms happens in Europe, happens in the Middle East, happens among the Muslims lands, happens in India, happens in China. All of this starts to happen in the same time period. And what happens is the Mongols, these Central Asian horse warriors, nomadic warriors, they take advantage of this and they start attacking in these different areas. Basically, weak. These new territories are weak because they don't have these large, powerful empires anymore. They're smaller, independent, so they're easier to be attacked. Easier, they're weaker. We see Mongol invasions begin at the beginning of the 13th century on the northern borders of China under the leadership of Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, or goes by multiple different names, who lived from 62 to 27, circa, around that time period. And then in the 1230s, we see the attack spread. Again, it starts in China, northern China. By the 1230s, we see the attack spread by the Mongols and his sons and relatives, multiple different kings, from Russia, Poland, Hungary, India, into Persia, China. Parts of China is taken over. Actually, almost all of China is taken over at one point. This Genghis Khan gets started, what becomes the greatest empire the world has ever known. No empire has ever had the square mileage of the Mongol Empire. At one point, the Mongols control part of Eastern Europe and pretty much all of Asia. All of it, pretty much. With the exception of the southern half of India, they controlled all of it. Everything. Yeah, no other empire has ever been anywhere near the size of this ever. By the 1250s, they had conquered Eastern Europe. They had conquered all of Persia. They had conquered northern India. They had conquered China by the 1250s, 1270s. Where do they stay and rule the longest? Outside of Mongolia itself. Mongolia, which is in Eastern Asia. Today, I believe Mongolia is a separate independent country. but for a long time, Mongolia was really part of Russia. Um, uh, Other than Mongolia itself, the Mongols probably ruled the longest in maybe Russia. China, they only ruled for a while. That's the other thing about the Mongol Empire. It rises to be the greatest ever, but then it actually comes apart pretty quickly. It was simply too big. They ruled Russia for over 200 years. They really ruled and controlled Russia for about 2 centuries. They were known as the Golden Horde, the Golden Horde in Russia. This was the Mongol Empire. It became, it became Russia. Really, they became the Russian aristocracy, the Russian nobility. They ran and governed the territory of Russia, which is mostly Asia, for close to 2 centuries. Um, and they allowed the Russian princes and kings to stay and maintain independence, autonomy, semi-autonomous. As long as they continued to pay taxes and owe allegiance to the Mongols, the Russian lords were able to stay in power. This is how they were able to rule for 200 years. They let all the local power bases stay, and they just simply owed fealty and taxes, and they owed allegiance to the Mongols. Whenever the Mongols called, the Russians had to send soldiers to go and fight for the Mongols, the Mongol hordes. Um, the Mongols took over China, and they're probably the ones that actually opened China to European trade for the first time, open direct trade. Because at that point, that when the Mongols conquered China, they've conquered Eastern Europe. As I said, Hungary, Poland, those areas, Russia. So in essence, through the Mongol Empire, you could have Europe directly connected to China, which was like 8,000 miles away, something like that. Direct connection going through the Mongol Empire, which spanned from Europe all the way to China. Access to a lot of goods. Access to lots of goods. We see missionaries, diplomats, merchants traveling around the seas, traveling through the riverways, of course, traveling over land. Most of you have probably heard of Marco Polo, not necessarily the swimming pool version. Polo, Marco Polo, we've all done that. Marco Polo was a world traveler. He wrote about the Mongols. He lived among the Mongols, and he traveled back and forth between Europe and China, back and forth between the two. A lot of this activity really paves the way for Christian missionaries to actually move into Asia, into China, into Central Asia. The Mongols didn't really convert over to Christianity. We actually see more Mongols probably being Muslim than any other faith. But because Mongols ruled over Christian Russians, which would have been, I guess, Eastern Orthodox Christianity mostly, the people in the Mongol Empire, certainly in parts of Asia and Europe, were Christians. So we see Christianity really start to, in essence, have an open doorway. Because Asia had not been Christian. Christianity had really not moved into Asia. Not really. So how does Christianity move into Asia? How do we see eventually millions of Christians in Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, tens of millions of Christians in China? How does it happen? It happens because of the Mongols. The Mongols, because they have connections in the Christian world and rule over Christian kingdoms, Christianity and the Christian missionaries are able to move and actually basically transmit their religious teachings all across Asia via the Mongol territories. Very interesting. So thus, the Mongols threw open new routes to the east. They opened up trade routes. They opened up new connections with religion and science and technology. The Mongols really bring the two halves of the world together for the first time, truthfully. Even though there had always been trade routes that went through the Middle East from China to Europe, really bringing East and West together for the first time is probably what the Mongols do, because for the first time we have one empire which rules both East and West. The Muslims never really rule in the West. Yes, they have the Spain, but most of Europe is still not Muslim. And the Christians never rule in the East. So via the Mongols, they actually connect the world. I read a really great book. I can see it up there on the shelf, almost see it too, a couple years back, which is all about the Mongols. And the title of the book is, I can't see it, but it's something to the form of how the Mongols changed the world. That this author, this historian, gives credit to the Mongols for the modern world. Really, our modern world was created by what the Mongols do. And it isn't exactly what they do, but it's what they facilitate. The fact that they do have this overlapping empire, which pretty much conquers, half of the known world, um, literally half of the known world, uh, brings the whole world together. Religion, science, technology, culture, food, animals. I mean, all of it. It really connects the world. Um, yeah, it really interesting what they do. And of course, this really spurs the imaginations of the Europeans who want more exotic goods, more spices. They want more treasures. They want more wealth. They want more. They want access to all of these great goods, which affects the European voyages of exploration, in which the Europeans explore the world and become the dominant power in Europe and in the world until today. Europeans are still the dominant power in the world, although, eh, it may not be quite there yet, but we're pretty close to Asia becoming the. I mean, the 20th century was often thought to be the Western century of America and Europe. 21st century is probably going to be the Asian century, probably. Um, but for the next 500 years, the world is pretty much dominated by Europeans, and a big part of that was them trying to continue to expand their power in a lot of the things they learned through the Mongols, a lot of the new ideas and the opportunities they learned through the Mongols. It's really interesting. The Mongols, right here, baby. In 1260, the greatest conquerors in history. This is well over 3 times the size of the Roman Empire. All of China, pretty much, the Middle East, northern India, the Muslim lands, all of Russia, all the way to Eastern Europe. There's never been anything ever like this. Now, it is only unified for a while. Shortly after Genghis Khan dies, his sons split it up, grandsons split it up, and you have different ones. You have the Khanate of the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanid, the Chagatai, the Yuan Empire. So they're separate empires after Genghis Khan, but they're still all Mongols. And they don't usually war with each other. Most of the time, they work in partnerships and alliances. Very interesting. Classic Arab artwork from the Ilkhanid Empire. This is the Ilkhanid Empire right here. Muslim Empire. Well, now it's Mongol Muslim Empire. This is classical artwork from the Ilkhanid Empire. So when they conquered the Middle East, Mongols generally converted to Islam. The Mongols, they became Islamic. They received and they continued living with the old traditions of Persia. In many ways, actually revived Persian ideas and Persian knowledge and Persian learning and technology. Much of it which had been forgotten during the Islamic domination. Remember, Muslims weren't Persians. Persians are separate. Persians are different people, an ancient people long before Islam. Um, Muslims are traditionally Muslims are Arab, and Arabs are from the Arabian Peninsula. This is Persia. This would be Arabia. So understand when we think about Muslims, they are an Arabian people that took over other territories. Like even when the Muslims took over Africa, they weren't really thought of as African people. They were still thought of as Arabian people ruling over northern Africa. Even in Spain, even when Muslims took over Spain, they were still often thought of as Arabian people that were ruling over Spain. Um, so make sure you understand Persians and Arabs are not the same. Different language too, totally different language. The Persian language is Farsi, I think. If I'm wrong, I apologize. I think it's Farsi, and of course the Arabic language the Arab language is Arabic. So they're different languages. So when they took over the Ilkhanids, which had been ruled by the Muslims, what they did was they converted Islam because that was the standard at that by this point in time. Most authority and most power in the trade, it was all in Islamic. So they converted to Islam, but the actual peoples were still Persians. The actual population were still mostly Persian peoples. So they revive a lot of the old Persian art and the Persian styles, which had sort of gone out of disfavor, because the Arab people had really focused on Arab culture, not Persian culture. So they revive a lot of the Persian culture, which had sort of been forgotten and had been dominated by Arabic culture. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. We see elements of Chinese themes in here, the colors and the animals. The animal imagery and the whole blue color is reminiscent of uh, is it a Ming? Oh goodness, hope I'm not sure if I'm right about that, but like Ming vases, certain types of Chinese pottery. Um, Really beautiful stuff. I mean, the artwork on this, look at it. It's imagine. I mean, like today you see something like this, and most likely it's made in a machine in a factory by by a machine. This is handmade. Every bit of this, every single line is drawn and painted. The artwork, it's all handmade. I mean, it's beautiful. Beautiful. This is if this was an actual antique. Imagine how much this would be worth. It's beautiful. All right, our last thing we're going to talk about is death. I didn't really get into the fact that the Mongols were terrorists. Yeah, you'd have to read that book I was telling you about. It is, yeah, how the Mongols changed the world. I mean, you could look up, lots of stuff on the internet. They would they would move into a new territory, and they would ask for the people to open their gates of their cities and to give over to Mongol subjugation and to pay allegiance to the Mongols and pay their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And if they ever challenged them, the Mongols would just burn the city, destroy the whole city. Mongols used siege weapons. They were really one of the first empires to really use massive mobile siege weaponry, and they would just destroy the city. That's where like the catapults and the trebuchets and different stuff like this. And I don't know exactly what siege weaponry they use, but that's what siege weaponry is. It's where you use these big machines that would actually destroy the city, would destroy the walls, they would burn the city down, and they would do that. They would not even take surrender. And they would burn down sometimes 1/5 of all cities in a region, killing thousands. We think the Mongols probably killed millions of people. Bad. I mean, they were bad. They're like the worst, most violent conquerors in the history of the world. They would kill millions. They would destroy 1/5 of all cities. So the other 4/5 of the cities would all immediately throw open their gates and surrender. I mean, it worked, but it was, I mean, bad, brutal. Just come into a region where there's 50 cities and just destroy 10 of them. Just burn down and destroy and murder thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of people. Just completely level 10 cities. So the other 40 cities will immediately surrender and give in to your domination and your conquest. Yeah, Mongols did that kind of stuff. Uh, so let's talk about another form of death. Lots and lots of death. This is a very deadly time in history, not to mention the conquest of the Mongols and the great famines and the bubonic plague is in this time period, the Black Death. Oof, Black Death alone killed like what, 1/3 or 1/4 of all Europeans? 100 million people maybe? Gone. 1/3 of the entire continent dead in a number of years. But there's other things than just the plague. Natural disasters, political ineptitude often brought the great disasters. For instance, the Great Famine of 22 to 15 to 22 here. Heavy rains destroyed crops. Okay, rain is good, right? Not too much rain. Heavy rains and flooding destroyed the crops. Animals died of disease because, well, lots of water and wetlands breed mosquitoes, disease vectors, which then spread among the animals. The animals die and are infected by disease and infection, and they die. Um, this scarcity, now that the crops are destroyed and the animals are dead, causes food prices to go through the roof. People are starving to death. Um, the plants are dead, the animals are dead. All this leads to hunger, disease, and death. Pretty bad. Now, the peasants are the most hard hit. Peasants are, of course, the most hard hit. Some wealthy, lords, churches, monasteries, things like this, they often profited by selling their food supplies, their food, extra food they had in storage. They would then sell it back to the peasants, making high profits. We see this pretty common among lords, churches, monasteries, merchants doing this kind of stuff. How bad was it? Well, about 10% of European population died in this time period. 10% of the entire European population. This leads to a massive loss of manpower and productivity. But on the other hand, there's a good side of it. There's now jobs for everyone. There's more land available for people. And a thinner population means the actual amount of disease and poverty decreases because there's simply jobs available for more people. So when the famine's over, Europe actually has an economic boom because there's fewer people, more jobs available. There's now empty farms and farmhouses. So there's opportunities to fill in the gaps for the 10% of the population that's now gone. So the economy actually booms after these disasters. Happens every time. Mass death, destruction, and misery, and then the people that live through it, their life is actually better. They see an increased standard of living, an increased happiness. Hey, we lived, we won. You know, maybe 2 of our kids died, our uncle died, our aunt died, and our grandmother all died. But those of us that lived are going to have a better life now. Some people thought this was God's punishment. That God was punishing Europeans. God was bringing the famine, punishing us for our sins. We see the church increase in power and authority, because obviously if people think that people are being punished for their sins, they are going to run to the only ones that can save you, which is the church, to give you absolution, to show you how to give penance, to forgive you for your sins. So this actually increases the power and the authority of the church. And the church facilitated this. The church actually would have large meetings. They would have people go down the streets. They would have the prayers. They would tell the populations, you must repent of your sins. The church exacerbated this, making it seem like they profited and benefited off of the misery, and increased their power as a result of it. Some practical responses could be simply giving out food. We do see increased giving out food by charitable monasteries. We do see charitable church organizations give out food, help people from starving to death, poor houses, charity, stuff like this. We do see kings making some changes, lowering interest rates on loans, giving out food stores at the kings, because kings usually had large food stores in palaces and storehouses guarded by soldiers. Sometimes they would give out the food. Sometimes they would do that. We also see lots of people going eastward towards the Mongol territories. Most of this was really in Western and Central Europe. So if you actually got out of Western and Central Europe, you could find more prosperous lands going east in Eastern Europe. We see charity on the rise as well. Now, social and political causes of this. Large growth, way too big growth. Growth was too fast. Even the smallest crop failure could cause widespread disease and panic when you have a population that is literally living season to season. The population was growing so fast in Europe that on a season-by-season basis, there was no surplus in many places. Or if there was a surplus, it was hoarded. Hoarded by monasteries, hoarded by kings. Because there was a limited supply of food and there was food shortages already, even before the famine, we see power being associated with food. Therefore, if you were able to hoard food supplies, you could have power and authority over the community around you, whether you were a king or a religious institution, the church, monasteries. It could allow you to dominate your local populations because you're the only ones who have the food. You're the only ones who can keep their kids from starving. We see that. Even the smallest failures could cause disaster. Well, the Great Famine wasn't a small failure. It was a 7-year freaking disaster. It was devastating. It was really bad. Political causes of this, well, there was warfare. There was always warfare in Europe. Princes and kings always fighting over land and territory. Of course, wars are fought in the fields, so wars destroy crops as well. This diverts manpower and resources away from feeding people. It isn't like the war stopped during the famine. People kept fighting. There was still war and violence. So wars divert resources and food and money away from the starving populations to, of course, go to the soldiers. Diverts resources and food and manpower because that's fewer people working the farms because they have to pick up swords instead and put down their plows or whatever. It also disrupts the economy. Political leaders even made this worse. We see some places they actually increase taxes. Why? Well, this is, people would pay their taxes in food still. Yeah, we do have a money economy in some places like Italy or France, but in much of Europe, still people paid their taxes in food. There's no food because the crops are dying, the rains, the heavy rains, the famines, the animals dying, so people can't pay their taxes. Well, the kings and the lords still want to be rich and wealthy. They still need their power. They still have to pay for all of their servants and all of their serfs and all of their fancy lifestyle. So what's their response? They increase the taxes. It's a weird irony, isn't it? The people are starving, they don't have money, they're dying of disease, and you're going to up their taxes? Where do you think? Where are they going to get the money from? I mean, what's that saying? You can't get blood from a rock or something like that. I mean, there's nothing left. Some kings make this stuff worse. All they care about is their power and glory. Um, or taking food away from the poor, giving it to their soldiers, causing the poor to starve to death, the kids to starve, the families to starve. Also, the kings continue fighting their wars. Yeah, we see resistance. We do see resistance, although it's not that effective. We see people attacking castles. We see assassinations. Um, we see people turning against the Jews, blaming the Jews for this, blaming the Jews for causing this. I don't know logic behind that necessarily, other than simply Jews have been the scapegoats for 2,000 years. Anytime something is wrong, fires in Rome, it's the Jews. Famines, it's the Jews. The Muslims are defeating us, it's the Jews. It's always the Jews have been used as scapegoats for thousands of years of history in Europe. Um, so no reason they shouldn't be targeted here too. It's to be expected, I suppose. All right, now we're going to come to our discussion question. But you're wondering, when the hell was that? Why hasn't there been one? Well, here it is. So you might need to look this. You might need to. I don't know if you have to like blow it up or make it look bigger or not. I don't know if I even really can do that here on the screen. You can do it on your phones, your computers. Have a look at this image here. It's about the famine. It's about the famine in Florence, Italy. What do you see in here that talks about all the things I just mentioned? What do you see in this image that actually in some way describes the famine or talks about the effects of the famine? Give you some hints. You have all the people down here, but what are the people down here doing? Can you see that? Those people don't look very good. Some of them are on the ground. Wonder what's happening there. What do you think these baskets are here? What do you think those represent? What will be something that might be held in the baskets? Think about that. What is this here? Is this an angel? Why is the angel in black? Why is it a black angel? Black clothing. What does black usually represent? Aren't angels usually portrayed in white, angelic? Why is there an angel portrayed in black? That's interesting. Um, uh, what does that mean? We have the church over here. Obviously, you have church institution over here. What does that represent? What do we have here? Who are these images? That should be pretty obvious who they are. And what are these people doing here when it looks like we have like what look like merchants actually buying and selling goods here? What could that mean? I mean, people are starving to death, but the merchants are still requiring you to pay for the food. You could look at that from two different ways. If you're the poor, obviously you can't pay for the food. But what if you're a merchant? Can you give away all your food for free? What happens to you then? Think about that. Now, if you're rich, you're rich. Hey, great. But a lot of merchants weren't rich. I mean, merchants was more of a middle class lifestyle. But, you know, the reality is, if you're a merchant, you might have also been very hard hit by this because people have to buy your goods. You have to find goods to purchase to sell to others. As a merchant, that's what you do. You buy and you sell. You buy and you sell. So think about that. What about the broken horns here? Usually the angels would have trumpets, like trumpets of sort of renouncing the words of God or the ideas of heaven, scripture. What's with the broken trumpets? What does that mean? What could that represent? Um, so look at all that. Look at the people, the baskets. What if what the idea of the church over here is the merchants selling food, the people dying in the streets, the black angels, the trumpets, and think about that. Think about what life was like in Florence during the famine. Does it mean Florence was good? Was it bad? Does it look like Florence might have had it bad? You have to infer a lot from this image. But considering the famine, and we've talked about the famine, think about what things was going on in Florence. Think about how whoever drew this, painted this basically this illuminated manuscript. What are they trying to convey? What was life like in Florence? Bear in mind, you also see soldiers here. I don't know if I didn't mention that, did I? You see soldiers with weapons. What does that mean? Why are there soldiers with weapons among the crowds of the poor and starving people? What are the soldiers there for? And who do the soldiers work for? Someone who might not be in the image. The soldiers work for the king. So the soldiers are representing the king. What are the soldiers doing? Lots of things in here, and there's probably a lot of different ideas you can get from it. Hopefully, you can sort of blow it up a little bit on your computer, on your phone, and you can look at it and sort of look at some detail. Um, but talk about it. Talk about everything going on in this image and what it represents, the famine in Florence, and how Florence is dealing with it, and what the situation is like in Florence. Guess what? That's it for the chapter. Here we have Europe in 1340, and that's really it for our chapter. You got France here, you have the Holy Roman Empire, you have the Papal States, as I said, which are still independent. You have the Khanate over here, Khanate of the Golden Horde over here. We have retaken almost all of Spain now from the Muslims. Not quite. This region here is still Muslim. We don't, it's still 100 years. It's still, wow, over 100 years before this last corner over here is finally retaken. There's Castile. That's where the mother of Louis, the mother of Louis there in France came from. Anyway, that's it for this chapter. A little bit shorter than the others. And thanks for sticking out with me. Thanks. Bye.